In September 2003, a middle school principal in La Ciotat is killed in his school's parking lot.
He had time to say, "I was stabbed," but he didn't say a name or anything.
Who would want to kill Clément Roussenq, a 55-year-old husband and father?
It doesn't make any sense. Murdering a principal at a school in La Ciotat?
Very soon, the investigators discovered that the victim had fallen into a trap.
The setup was like something from a movie. It was well thought of, it was calculated. They were waiting to kill him.
Since the start of the school year, the principal's behavior had changed.
You could tell he was worried. I thought to myself, he's scared of something.
Could Clément Roussenq have been murdered by a student or a teacher?
He didn't really have friends, and he didn't necessarily go out of his way to make any at school. When he had to reprimand the students, he reprimanded them. He suspended them. He called the parents in. With the teachers, it was the same.
Did the principal's authoritarianism lead to the murder?
Clément Roussenq is the sheriff. Clément Roussenq is the police. Clément Roussenq keeps a tight rein. He's strict, he's narrow-minded, and he isn't here to have fun.
What if the motive for the murder is hidden in the victim's past?
They looked into all his assignments as a Frenchman abroad. This double life as a special agent. Huge things.
The police have identified several suspects but have failed to unmask the culprit. Their investigations have yet to solve the case. We're in the Bouches-du-Rhône department in La Ciotat, a Mediterranean port city known for its shipyards. This is the town where one night in September 2003, a school principal was fatally stabbed. Clément Roussenq was 55 years old. He was passionate about his job. His murder, committed on the school grounds, provoked strong emotions and the indignation of the Minister of National Education. Leading the investigation, officers from the Marseille police force have followed numerous leads and placed nearly 40 individuals in custody. But their investigations have not yet been able to identify the perpetrator. We're looking back at a case that remains unsolved to this day. On Thursday, September 25, 2003, Clément Roussenq, the principal of Virebelle Middle School in La Ciotat, is woken up by a phone call. It's 11:02 p.m. Caroline Roussenq, his youngest daughter, remembers that evening in detail.
That evening, September 25th, my parents went to bed early. It was an ordinary evening like any other. Nothing stood out to me in particular. The only thing that really stuck with me was that he fell asleep before receiving the phone call.
Hervé Joanneau is a very close friend of Clément Roussenq's.
Clément picks up the phone and they say, "This is the harbor master's office. We're calling about your boat. It's drifting away. It's not moored."
Clément Roussenq then tells his wife, Helen, that he must leave immediately for the port. The round trip should take about 20 minutes.
Any boat owner who loves their boat, even in the middle of the night, gets up if the boat is in danger.
Clément Roussenq leaves his official accommodation, which is on the school grounds. He heads to his car in the school parking lot so he can go check on his boat's moorings. His wife stays behind in the apartment.
She thought, a phone call at this time of night from the harbor master's office? But isn't that their job? A boat's adrift, but the time... Well, those were the thoughts going through my mom's head.
15 minutes later, the school principal phones his wife. Helen Roussenq tells her eldest daughter, Magali, about this call.
He called Mom to reassure both her and himself. He told her, "I've tied the boat back up and I'm on my way."
At 11:30, Helen Roussenq hears the school gates open.
My mom remembers that she saw the automatic gate light up as it opened. And she thought, okay, he's back. She was relieved because she was a bit worried at the time.
She hears the car stop, the gates close. She has time to get up, and I think she goes to the bathroom. And when she comes back, Dad still hasn't come back.
Helen Roussenq is worried. She goes to the living room to see what's happening in the parking lot.
She hears him scream, but I think he's actually calling her. And that's when she goes to the small glass door and she sees 2 or maybe 3 shadows dashing into the night at the back of the parking lot.
From her apartment window, Helen Roussenq then hears her husband's last words.
He had time to tell her, "I've been stabbed," or "They've stabbed me." I don't know, but he didn't say a name or anything. Yes, it was like a movie.
At the same time, on the second floor of the building, the unusual noises from outside draw the attention of Achille Maggiore, the school technician.
At some point, I hear screaming like that. And then I get up, and I go to my window, which overlooks the school parking lot, and there, in front of me, I see Clément, slumped over his steering wheel and honking continuously. And I think, oh no, he's in trouble. And I go outside. I get out there.
Convinced that Clément Roussenq has suffered a heart attack, the technician calls the emergency services and runs to the parking lot. A few moments later, Helen Roussenq joins him.
I get to the driver's side of the car, where Clément is. I give him a nudge. Hélène comes out and gets into the passenger side. She takes Clément close to her and she tells me he's been stabbed. I look at Clément, his eyes are rolled back and he's in pain. And I think, he's been stabbed. Oh no.
Helen Roussenq and Achille Maggiore immediately realize the gravity of the situation.
I say he has to hang in there. The ambulance is coming. He has to hang in there. He mustn't let go. He mustn't fall asleep. He mustn't pass out. I shake him a little and I say, Clément, stay with us. And his eyes open.
But Clément Roussenq eventually loses consciousness. At 11:45 p.m., the paramedics arrive at the scene.
The paramedics take him. We go with him. They put him on the ground. They get out the defibrillator. And then they tell us, don't stand there. Let us work.
A few minutes later, the emergency services are joined by the La Ciotat police and the Aubagne Rapid Response Unit. After several attempts at resuscitation, Clément Roussenq dies in his school's parking lot. He was 55 years old.
A woman from the Rapid Response Team confirms he's dead. Hélène stays poised. She doesn't cry or anything. She's drained.
Helen Roussenq then has the difficult task of informing her daughters that their father is dead.
You're going to have to be very strong, Maga. Something has happened to Dad. And I ask, what happened? And she tells me, 2 men, or they have killed him.
She told me in these words, "Dad is dead, he's been killed." So for me, it was a trick. It was inconceivable. I said, "What do you mean he's been killed? Come on, what are you saying?" She told me, "He's been murdered. I don't know why." In fact, he seemed immortal to me. I couldn't imagine him getting sick. I couldn't imagine him weak. And losing him made a lot of things fall to pieces.
The La Ciotat police cordon off the area to protect the crime scene. At the public prosecutor's request, detectives from the Marseille Homicide Squad come to Virebelle Middle School's parking lot. At 12:30 a.m., they start making their preliminary findings. They work alongside the forensic identification officers who are responsible for collecting samples.
The parking lot was full of flashing lights. They were everywhere. It was like being on a detective show. There was the National Crime Squad, the Regional Crime Squad, the Forensic Unit. It was all systems go.
Yves Robert is a representative of the Marseille Police Officers Union.
When the Marseille Homicide Squad arrived, Mr. Roussenq was taken out of his vehicle. He was laid down on the left-hand side of the vehicle.
The paramedics lay Clément Roussenq on the ground near the car, with his head next to the left rear door.
Inspecting a body that has been moved is not necessarily a problem. It's something that happens very often. The homicide detectives used the paramedics' and police officers' statements to find out what position the body had been found in.
The victim's car is parked about 40 feet from the building's south-facing facade, where the Roussenqs lived on the 3rd floor. The front of the vehicle is facing the school's main entrance. 3 streetlights illuminate the parking lot. Gerard Cristol Esquire was Helen Roussenq's first lawyer. He recalls the initial investigations.
Mr. Roussenq's car was located where he usually parked. He didn't have a specific spot there, but in general, he parked there. It's the least lit up part of the schoolyard.
A medical examiner from Timon Hospital in Marseille arrives at the scene to examine the victim's body. Dr. Olivier Jardet explains his colleague's findings.
From the outset, it was clear that a sharp weapon was used. There was significant blood loss. It was found to be 2.5 pints, meaning life expectancy was less than 5 minutes.
Most of the time, when someone is stabbed, there are multiple wounds. However, that evening, Mr. Roussenq died only from a single stab wound.
The forensic identification officers then examine the victim's car.
The investigators first noticed that there was no damage to the vehicle, no dents, no scratches. It was in perfect condition. They also found that the engine was still warm.
The experts continued their investigations inside the car. Reporter Alexander Nasri covered the beginnings of the case for Le Figaro.
Nothing was stolen from Clément Roussenq. They didn't attack him to swipe his watch. His cell phone was still in the vehicle. Everything was where it should be. This was really a physical attack on Clément Roussenq.
On the floor by the passenger seat is Clément Roussenq's right shoe.
We can assume that when Mr. Roussenq was moved for the paramedics to resuscitate him, a shoe got stuck in the car. When the police arrived, he only had one shoe on his left foot.
The gear stick is in second, and the handbrake is not applied.
It looks like Mr. Roussenq was attacked just as he was pulling up. He hadn't even applied the handbrake yet.
At 3 a.m., morticians from Marseille pick up Clément Roussenq's body and take it to Timon Hospital for an autopsy. In the school parking lot, the crime scene investigation continues. The specialists look for fingerprints on the body of the victim's car. DNA samples are also taken from inside and outside the vehicle. The detectives then expand their investigation area and leave the school grounds in search of clues. On the sidewalk in front of the school, to the right of the gates, the forensic technicians immediately notice several objects that litter the ground.
In front of the school, beer cans and packaging were found, which could provide the investigation with useful clues.
The beer six-pack contains 5 empty cans. The 6th can is found right next to it. Achille Maggiore then tells the investigators an important piece of information.
I look at it and I say, that's not normal. I tell them every morning, I'm the one who opens the school gates. Every single morning. I've never, ever seen beer cans like that on the sidewalk by the gate.
The investigators place the packaging and the cans into evidence bags. After making their preliminary findings, the police try to determine which route was taken by the individuals that Helen Roussenq saw.
At the back of the school, there was a possible escape route that was relatively discreet, and you wouldn't know about it if you were there at night and had planned the crime 10 minutes earlier.
There was a small gate, which would be easy for someone in good shape to jump over.
The 10,000 square foot forest behind the parking lot is meticulously searched.
The main difficulty is making these findings at night in a place with no light. The murder weapon isn't found. It's difficult, after searching Mr. Roussenk's vehicle and the parking lot, to see whether the weapon has been thrown into the woods or whether the perpetrators have taken off with the weapon.
At 5 a.m., the Marseille police leave the scene.
It really is an unusual murder that will leave the investigators very weary of the perpetrator or perpetrators.
It's complicated. There are no witnesses, except Mrs. Roussenq, who saw 2 or 3 figures leaving. There's no solid evidence, just a pack of beer. There's no murder weapon. There's no vandalism, there's no theft. There's nothing.
Jean-Marc, we're in the parking lot of Virebelle Middle School in La Ciotat, the very place where Clément Roussenq was fatally stabbed. The fact that the victim was the principal of this school immediately makes this case completely unique.
Of course. Clément Roussenq's profession makes this investigation unique and complicates matters. It's always more challenging to investigate in a closed professional environment, and public education is one of them. Of course, this isn't the army, where silence is golden. But the teaching world, as they say, has its own culture, traditions, and sometimes secrets. The investigators will have to uncover them, understand them, and deal with them.
So as we can see, Clément Roussenq was killed in front of the windows of a small building containing official accommodation, where the school staff and management lived, including Mr. and Mrs. Roussenq. Wasn't it risky to carry out a crime here?
No, on the contrary. I think that this place was particularly well chosen. It's a closed, shut-off place. The murder happened at a time when there were no passers-by and in a poorly lit area. Clearly, the culprits had pinpointed this place and knew it was possible to escape quickly and discreetly through the small gate behind the school at the bottom of this parking lot.
You mentioned culprits in the plural. In fact, we know that thanks to Hélène Roussenq's testimony that there were 2 or 3 attackers. Unfortunately, the principal's wife could not provide the police with a physical description of these individuals. However, could the fact that there were multiple perpetrators help guide the investigation?
Yes, because on the face of it, that means we can rule out emotional motives such as a crime of passion. Because in that type of homicide, there is always a single perpetrator. Someone who feels betrayed or jealous always acts alone.
According to the preliminary findings, the murder happened very quickly, just after Clément Roussenq had parked his car. We know he didn't even have time to put the gear stick back in neutral or to apply the handbrake.
This murder happened in a flash. I think the attacker barely waited until the car stopped to open the door and stab the driver. There was no verbal altercation. The perpetrator came here only to kill the principal.
The killer only stabbed him once. Does that surprise you?
Yes, of course. I see 2 possible explanations. Either the killer is very self-confident or, on the contrary, extremely jittery. There's only one thought in the killer's mind: to flee. I'm leaning more towards this second theory.
There's a particularly intriguing element in this case, the call from the harbor master's office, which caused Clément Roussenq to leave his house. It's hard not to join the dots between this phone call and the murder.
Yes, I wonder whether the call was legitimate. If you know a harbor master office's customs and practices, you'll know that the person who notices a boat's mooring line is becoming loose will fix it themselves, without needing to warn the owner. The investigators must verify where this call came from.
While these checks are being carried out, the police paint a portrait of the victim. They hope their inquiries into his character will help guide the investigation.
You either loved Clément Roussenq or you hated him. He always said hello with a firm handshake and his eyes wide open. When he said hello, he looked you in the eyes and scrutinized you to see if you were okay.
His very presence had an air of authority. With one look, when I was a child, I knew what to do and what not to do.
Clément Roussenq had been the principal of Virebelle Middle School in La Ciotat since September 2000. He carried out his role with passion. It was truly his calling.
He came from that tradition of old-fashioned teachers. like 19th century schoolmasters who take children's education very seriously and are always right behind them, checking if they're behaving.
However, Clément Roussenq ended up in teaching by chance. In 1973, he chose to carry out his military service in Senegal as a teacher. Dominique Fournier was Clément Roussenq's roommate in Dakar.
That first full year of teaching awakened a calling. Although he didn't originally have the training or ambition, in any case, he never stopped.
Always, when he met teenagers who said, "God, I don't like school, I'm tired of school," he would say, "Well, I was the same. I didn't like school, but you can see I'm still here."
Clément Roussenq decided to continue his teaching career abroad and invited Helen, his partner who stayed in France, to join him.
He met Helen before coming to Dakar. I clearly remember we were reading our letters at the table, and when Clément opened an envelope, little hearts fell on his plate. And of course, we took the opportunity to make fun of him, to tease him.
The couple got married in 1974 in Dakar. Both teachers, they took a series of posts abroad. From their love, 2 children were born, Magali and Caroline. Louis Cousy is Helen Roussenq's brother.
They looked the picture of a together and happy family, but they made pretty eccentric lifestyle choices. Living in a small African village 30 to 60 miles from Abidjan is not for everyone.
I had a very rich childhood. Once we set off on the first trip, the first transfer, the second transfer, I think they started to really get a taste for it.
In 1989, Clément Roussenq passed the school principal's exam and became a principal in Cairo. He was then appointed principal of the prestigious French International School in Washington.
I remember how happy he was when he got that position. It was impossible to miss. Personally, I remember being very proud.
He was selected for prestigious positions because they clearly saw Clément's worth in the poise, seriousness, and rigor that dominated his character.
But after several years abroad, the National Education Department requires expatriate employees to return to France. At the age of 52, Clément Roussenq was forced to accept an assignment at Virebelle Middle School in La Ciotat.
Dad put La Ciotat as his last choice, and he got his last choice. So yes, he did choose it. I believe the list had about 20 choices on it. I think if he'd wanted his last choice, he would have put it first.
He felt that he wasn't given a lot of support with this transfer.
The arrival of this new principal with an unusual career caused a stir. His early days in La Ciotat were not easy.
He was a bit different from the traditional profile. He came to a small-town school after an amazing career. He wasn't an alien, but in the end, it isn't every day you see someone with this scope, this resume, this path. So he stood out.
Especially since the principal was rather authoritarian.
Dad's personality was exacerbated in his work. Frameworks, rules, his professional and personal rigor, he became even more regimented.
Thomas Alexosé, a former student of the school, remembers Clément Roussenq well.
He was someone who, every morning at 7:45 a.m., stood at the gates, said hello to all the students, and welcomed his students to school every morning. If he saw a student wearing a baseball cap, he would take the cap. He tried to lay down rules of good behavior, respect, and coexistence at the school.
The principal was also very strict with his teaching staff.
There were teachers who used to arrive dead on time or a minute late. He hated that. So as soon as the bell rang at the start of class, he went to the teacher's parking lot and waited for them. He gave them a little sermon like, "Don't do this to me again."
Clément Roussenq didn't really have friends, and he didn't necessarily go out of his way to make any at school. When he had to reprimand the students, he reprimanded them. He suspended them. He called the parents in. With the teachers, it was the same.
While ruling his school with an iron fist, Clément Roussenq gradually got used to La Ciotat. In April 2003, he fulfilled one of his dreams, buying a sailboat.
He loved the sea. Since he was a kid, he had sailed with his brother, so it was part of him. Yes, he was a sailor.
He named his boat after the school, Virebelle. He had even planned to take his most deserving students on field trips to teach them about the sea. He wanted to share his passion for the sea with his students.
At the time of his death, Clément Roussenq seemed to be a happy man who was recognized for his professional skills, and a principal who was sometimes criticized for his excessive strictness.
His death was unbelievable, because Dad wasn't a violent person. For him to be gone like that, to be killed when he was all about respect, no. No, it's very difficult to understand.
The day after the murder, the Deputy Minister of Education, Xavier Darcos, went to the scene of the tragedy. At the school's entrance, he states, "Let's not start saying that this is a case of student violence. We're dealing with a crime that for the moment is unexplainable and unexplained. Let's not make assumptions about some kind of academic vendetta. However, this is the lead that detectives from the Marseille Homicide Squad will focus on first." Virebelle Middle School has 700 students from 6th to 9th grade. The school has a good reputation. Alan Perrier was its chief education advisor until September 2003.
It's a very calm school with an average population. Students come from the local housing projects. There are no particular problems with the students.
However, there were several incidents in the months leading up to the crime.
We know very well that there's violence in schools. Teenagers are teenagers, but that they are as capable of violence at Virebelle as in many other French schools. Yes, it's been known to happen.
Immediately after the murder, the investigators questioned the school staff.
The police asked us, "Do you know if Clément Roussenq had any enemies?" to make progress as fast as possible. And that's when one student came to mind. Clément had just suspended the student for a week. He'd had problems with him. So the first person who came to mind was him.
The student in question, age 14, is in 9th grade.
The day Mr. Roussenq was murdered was the final day of this boy's suspension. You can imagine that, feeling humiliated and excluded. This boy wanted to get revenge.
The psychiatrist Daniel Glezer explains what could have provoked a teenager to commit the crime.
Suspending a student from school can generate hyperactivity and sensory overload, which can quickly lead to excessive violence.
A few hours after the murder, at 6:30 in the morning, the student is questioned at his home. He is then taken into custody at the police station in Marseille. The police discover that this teenager has already been involved in a vandalism case.
Along with some friends, he had wrecked a beekeeper's hives. The police informed Clément Roussenq about what had happened. The parents were called in.
The investigators study the boy's personality.
He's one of 2 or 3 students in that year who are a pain in the neck. And the problem is, he's in 9th grade now, and he's flunking. He's becoming unmanageable because he gets bored in class, so he's disruptive.
This student has committed vandalism. This student is restless and loud. He throws things. He defaces school property. He's particularly disruptive.
On top of that, his mother spoiled him. She coddled him like he was the boy king. It was never his fault. It was someone else's fault. She never doubted herself when it came to her son.
The teenager is violent and rebels against authority.
This student was expressing himself more and more harshly, both in his behavior and his words.
If he can get away with it, he does it. So he can graffiti, spit, insult. And then the moment he comes up against authority, there's a problem. And that's the case here.
The investigators learned that Clément Roussenq decided to suspend the unmanageable teenager for a week without going through a disciplinary committee. It's a severe and unusual punishment.
There was a head-on clash between the principal and this boy. You can imagine, he started hating him. There's an expression, "I'm hacked off." He was hacked off.
He wasn't a principal who was quick to suspend students. I think if he suspended that student that week, something serious must have happened. He wouldn't have suspended him for no reason.
While in custody, the student explains that the principal suspended him because he had insulted a teacher. He also admits to throwing things at the teacher, but he denies any involvement in the crime.
He says on the night of Mr. Roussenq's murder, he was at home, which is confirmed by his mother and father, who say, yes, he was with us.
This 14-year-old was taken into custody. Police custody isn't easy. The police must have used every possible psychological technique to find out if this teenager was involved in the crime. At the end of his custody, he was released, and in a way, became the first lead to be ruled out.
After 12 hours in police custody, the boy was able to return to his family home. There are no charges against him today.
The theory about the student getting revenge after being excluded, I don't believe for a second. But it was considered, so I think the police had to do their job by going through all the exclusions and suspensions. But I never thought a student had killed my father. I never thought that.
Clément Roussenq was murdered 3 weeks into the school year. It's a sensitive time for the Ministry of National Education. This may explain why Xavier Darcos, the Deputy Minister of Education at the time, rushed to La Ciotat to dismiss the theory of student violence. After his first statements in front of the school gates, he drove his point home by adding, "Let's not make up stories about a public servant being murdered over disciplinary problems." We don't have any proof to suggest that this case is connected to Clément Roussenq's work.
I remember that statement very well. It stunned me then. It's not for a minister to lead a criminal investigation. That's the district attorney's job.
The latter responded to the minister very quickly and in a very direct way. Mr. Darcos says whatever he wants. He needs to say this isn't student violence, but that doesn't concern me.
The district attorney was right to clarify things, even in such sharp terms. This controversy is a good illustration of the pressures that politics can exert on an ongoing investigation. However, we know full well that in a criminal case, nothing can be ruled out. And here, it was obvious that the investigations were going to focus first on the school environment.
This theory led to the custody of a student who had been recently suspended by Clément Roussenq. It all happened very fast. He was taken into custody a few hours after the murder. Can you explain why the investigators needed to act so quickly?
I think the investigators were genuinely convinced that this teenager could be guilty. By acting so quickly, they wanted to avoid losing any evidence, such as a blood-stained knife, for example, or blood-stained clothes, and they were also concerned that the teenager would agree on an alibi with his accomplices that would then be difficult to disprove.
In the end, the teenager was in the clear. He was at home on the night of the murder. The police heard about other unruly students at Virebelle Middle School. Some were taken into custody and searches were carried out at their homes. But these investigations turned up nothing.
Yes, but it was necessary to rule out this lead as a matter of priority, even if, personally, I would imagine a teenager acting on impulse or anger, rather than coldly preparing and premeditating a murder.
The day after the crime, Friday, September 26, the school is closed. Investigations resume on the school premises to try and find the murder weapon. The news of the murder spreads throughout La Ciotat. Many students come to lay flowers to honor their principal's memory. On the same day, the autopsy of Clément Roussenq's body is carried out. Clément Roussenq's body enters the autopsy room at 10:30 a.m. The victim is of medium build and 5 feet 11 inches tall. The medical examiner begins with the external examination. The start of the autopsy can provide the investigation with essential information, as Dr. Olivier Jardet highlights.
There are no defense wounds. When someone is about to murder you, you try to defend yourself. What do? You hold up your hands or your elbows, and there are no wounds at all in these places. And so, either he knew his attacker very well, or he was taken completely by surprise, and he didn't necessarily see his attacker.
The medical examiner notices wounds on the victim's legs and head.
There are skin erosions on both knees, not deep wounds caused by friction. He also has rashes on his face.
The examiner focuses on the stab wound.
The wound is very, very high. It's between the second and the third rib, so it's very high. It's just outside the nipple, and it's totally symmetrical. This is characteristic of a stabbing with a knife.
The medical examiner then measures the length and depth of the wound. He concludes that the blade of the knife that killed Clément Roussenq is 1 inch wide and almost 4 inches long. For Dr. Olivier Jardet, there's no doubt about the assailant's criminal intent.
This stabbing was done with a lot of force, practically vertically, in an extremely sensitive area. And so everything leads me to think that this is someone who knew what they were doing.
The stabbing caused a fatal wound.
The wound is to the pulmonary artery, but also to the first valve of the heart, called the aortic valve. So this is a major wound to the cardiac and cardiopulmonary systems, which causes a massive hemorrhage and stops the cardiac system.
According to Dr. Jardet, Clément Roussenq would have fallen out of his car after being stabbed.
This would explain the lesions on his face and on his knees.
The principal would then have managed to get back into his vehicle. It was at this moment, summoning his last strength, Clément Roussenq shouted and alerted his wife. Since the start of the investigation, the police have been wondering about the phone call received by Clément Roussenq at 11:02 p.m. on the night of the crime. After learning that the harbor master's office closed at 5:30 p.m., they sent a request to France Telecom to find out the origin of this call. They discovered that the call was made from the payphone in front of the school.
Immediately, it's clear that this was an ambush. This crime was thought out. And that's when it becomes, quote unquote, more fascinating.
The setup was like something from a movie. It was well thought out, it was calculated. They were waiting to kill him.
The call made from the phone booth was therefore the first step in an elaborate plan to murder Clément Roussenq. A reporter for France 3, Edouard da Costa, emphasizes how organized the attackers were.
It would take several weeks of preparation and scouting, because they had to get Clément Roussenq's home phone number. They also had to think about how to make Clément leave his home in the middle of the night. So they had to come up with a valid reason.
One thing's for sure. They had to know my father to manage to call him and give him information about his boat. The boat would definitely get him out of the apartment.
In order to identify the caller, the forensic experts collect DNA samples from the payphone handset, keypad, and handle. They find many fingerprints.
It's a phone booth next to a school, which hundreds of students can use to make calls. It's next to a supermarket. Thousands of people could use this phone booth. So that makes the analysis very complicated.
On Friday morning, a few hours after the principal's murder, the investigators completely disassemble the phone booth and place the parts in evidence bags so that additional tests can be carried out in the laboratory. While the first phase of the ambush was to get Clément Roussenq to leave his home, the second was to break into the school. The police study the premises to try and work out where the assailants entered, where they lay in wait for their victim, and how they managed to flee.
The perpetrator or perpetrators have a perfect knowledge of the location. They know the layout. They have impeccable timing. They might even have timed it.
The attackers knew it would take Clément Roussenq about 20 minutes to make the round trip to the harbor. More than enough time for them to hide in the parking lot.
I've heard people say, breaking into this school is a piece of cake. It's easy.
Virebelle Middle School isn't a prison. It's a completely normal school with a modest-sized gate that's 6.5 feet tall. So it's not particularly difficult to get into for someone determined.
The investigators believe the attackers quietly sneaked onto the school grounds just as Clément Roussenq was driving away and before the automatic gate closed. The police then try to determine where the attackers waited for the principal to return.
At the school, there are quite a few bushes at the bottom of the schoolyard where they could hide, especially at night, even more so.
The investigators spot a thicket at the top of the parking lot. This thicket looks like the ideal place to keep an eye out. The preliminary findings showed that Clément Roussenq was fatally stabbed just moments after his return. We know from his wife's statement that the attackers fled towards the forest. The investigators then learned that the supermarket next to the school has a video surveillance camera outside. They are hoping for footage of the assailants. Maybe they fled in the supermarket's direction. The Marseille Homicide Squad head to the supermarket parking lot with a Achille Maggiore.
We got to the supermarket's escalators, and there was a camera above the escalators. And that night, coincidence or not, the camera was like this. It was pointing up, and it was the only camera in the area.
No footage of the killer's escape could be filmed on the evening of the murder because the camera lens was directed towards the sky. Could it have occurred to the perpetrators to change the camera angle before committing the crime?
You'd have to be very shrewd, climb up high and find a way to not be seen, because it's very suspicious to change a security camera's field of vision. So this suggests that whoever moved the security camera thought it through.
Since the footage recorded by this camera wasn't saved, it's unfortunately impossible to pinpoint when the camera was moved.
It's hard to understand such elaborate planning and scouting. It's almost an execution. These are the methods of killers, almost professional killers.
And on the night of the murder, oddly, the surroundings of the school were deserted.
Every night, there was a group of young people who hung out at the supermarket parking lot. Every night. But that night, there was no one.
We hear about all the steps the criminals took to kill Clément Roussenq. It's striking how much preparation there was for the murder. Do you think the attackers must have known their victim well to develop such a strategy?
What is certain is that this murder required very careful preparation. They had to know Clément Roussenq's habits, They had to know he owned a boat. They also had to know his phone number. But the problem is many people could have known this information. Practically everyone knew he lived on the school grounds. Practically everyone knew he had a boat. His phone number wasn't hard to find. It was listed in the directory. So this doesn't narrow the scope of the investigations or point towards a limited group of people.
But even so, can this modus operandi give us clues about the killer's profiles? One of the journalists we interviewed talked about the methods of killers, almost professional killers.
Personally, I wouldn't go that far or even close. It's true, the ambush seems to have been well planned, but the act itself doesn't seem to be the work of a methodical and calm, cold-blooded killer. Remember, they only stabbed him once, and they fled before even making sure their victim was dead.
Do you think it was the perpetrators themselves who, in preparation for the murder, moved the security camera outside the supermarket?
No, I think it's just a coincidence. In France, we haven't totally mastered video surveillance. It still isn't a big part of our lives, and even less so at the time of the incident. It's quite possible that this camera had been pointing towards the sky for several days without anyone noticing.
In the lead-up to the ambush, a mysterious call was made to Clément Roussenq at 11:02 p.m. The investigators learned that this call had been made from the public phone booth in front of the school.
The fact that the attackers made the call from there seems particularly interesting to me. It let them see whether their scheme was working. From where they were, they could see the principal leaving the school. They could check that he was alone. All they had to do was go back to the school and wait for the principal to return. The trap was set.
France Telecom was able to tell the police the duration of the call. Clément Roussenq spent 1 minute and 56 seconds on the phone. 1 minute and 56 seconds sounds like a long time.
Yes, and it seems even longer because we know from Clément Roussenq's wife that he barely spoke. It was basically a monologue. But to tell someone that their boat is unmoored, 20 to 30 seconds should be enough. If this call was actually about Clément Roussenq's boat, I don't understand why it went on for so long.
Thanks to Helen Roussenq's testimony, the investigators soon become aware of an event that took place shortly before the murder. An event that, in retrospect, could be interpreted as a first warning to the victim. The murder of Clément Roussenq followed a series of serious incidents that greatly disturbed the staff of Virebelle Middle School.
The 2003 school year was a disaster. All year long, we were harassed by a group of people who regularly came to damage the school. They set fire to the thicket, they attacked the kitchen with a Molotov cocktail, they damaged the school office several times. It always happened on weekends or during break.
It was like a little war game between these local thugs and the school.
On August 25, 2003, a month before his murder, Clément Roussenq had the unpleasant surprise of finding his car vandalized and extremely damaged. As usual, his car was parked in front of his accommodation. His wife took photos.
Some teenagers hadn't gone there and decided to blow it up in the moment. No, someone or a few people had obviously worked hard to wreck this vehicle.
The car looked like it was on a wasteland inside the school.
The principal was the target. His car was parked between mine and the administrators. His car was vandalized, while the administrators and mine weren't. Not even a scratch. So he was chosen. He was targeted. It was for him.
This act of vandalism affected Clément Roussenq greatly. Worried that the story would spread, he immediately asked a mechanic to come and pick up his car. On the condition of remaining anonymous, this mechanic has agreed to tell us about what he saw that day.
The vehicle's tires were punctured from the side. It looked like it had been done with a knife, just under an inch on the side of the tire. It requires a certain strength and a certain aggression. It's not an easy action. You have to do it without hesitation, like throwing a punch, for example.
Obscene writing, insults, flat tires, broken windows and windshields. The violence of the act surprised everyone who saw the vehicle.
I'd never seen vandalism like this. We've had cases of rough people who punctured the tires of a badly parked car, or windows being broken to steal from the vehicle, but I had never come across this kind of vandalism in my career.
A few hours after discovering his vandalized car, Clément Roussenq went to report it at the La Ciotat police station.
Clément Roussenq had hesitated for a long time about going to the police. He didn't want the police on the school premises. The graffiti and the damage to his car were serious enough for him to file a report. But he didn't want to make a whole thing of it.
In the afternoon, the principal found a knife and a marker in the forest bordering the school.
He said to me, "Here, this is what they used to write on the car with and slash the tires." So I looked. He was holding a marker and a kind of oyster knife. I looked at them and I said, "Are you sure?" Yes, yes, he was convinced. He told me definitely, "Look, it's the same color, the same thickness, and it's the same knife."
Surprisingly, Clément Roussenq never handed these two objects over to the La Ciotat police. After his murder, the knife and the marker were found in his office, but no DNA or fingerprints were found that could be useful for the investigation.
For a very long time, I've been strongly convinced that the vandalism on the car and the murder are connected. It was a warning which then led to what we know happened.
The police learned that the vandalized car incident changed the principal's behavior.
He lost his confidence. He no longer stood tall. He slouched, his eyes had darkened, his eyes no longer smiled, he was scared. He wanted us to cut down all the trees. He told me, "When I'm home, when I go down to my home, I want to see the whole school." He wasn't the same anymore. Clément Roussenq was no longer the same at the start of the 2003 school year.
When I think about that incident again, I really feel like they wanted my father to disappear. Maybe the people who vandalized the car thought it would make him want to leave. And in fact, Dad didn't want to stay anymore. I remember he suddenly started talking about a transfer, going abroad, etc.
Mom agreed for Dad to start preparing to move abroad again.
In September 2003, Clément Roussenq started his final year at Virebelle Middle School. He alerted his superiors to the school's lack of security.
He was worried. He told me he had asked the Board of Education to put cameras and spotlights in the parking lot. You could tell he was worried. I could feel it. I thought to myself, he's scared of something.
The police now know that Clément Roussenq had decided to leave La Ciotat. They suspected that the principal wanted to move away to escape danger, but the victim was a secretive man, and he never told his loved ones the precise reason for his concerns. The Marseille Homicide Squad's detectives want to uncover what was scaring Clément Roussenq. Hoping to find clues that will put them on the right track, they study the writing on his vandalized car. In the photographs of the vandalized vehicle, 3 letters written with a marker are clearly visible: FDL.
FDL could mean Phare de Loup, the projects near the school.
The Phare de Loup projects are 550 yards from Virebelle Middle School.
It's a working-class housing estate where drug deals happen. They deal cannabis, not cocaine. Unfortunately, this is rather common in projects in medium-sized cities. Phare de Loup has this profile, but it doesn't have a reputation for being extremely dangerous either.
The police discover that the dealers from the Phare de Loup projects often meet customers in front of Virebelle Middle School.
In terms of drugs, people knew it was easy to score drugs in the area around the school, and that it was a place where there was a lot of drug abuse.
Clément Roussenq went out of his way to stop the drug dealing.
Drug dealing meant his students weren't safe. It meant danger. He had to make the area safe for his own kids.
Even with small-scale cannabis dealing, a lot of money is made, so getting in the way can lead to trouble. It can make people angry. It can stir up hatred.
Clément Roussenq is the sheriff. Clément Roussenq is the police. Clément keeps a tight rein. He's strict, he's narrow-minded, and he isn't here to have fun.
Clément Roussenq was aware that this power struggle with the local small-time dealers could lead to trouble.
They were in Ciotat. While he was leaving the restaurant, someone on the street took a picture of him. So he said with a laugh, "Damn, there's a contract on my life. Knowing what happened next, you can't help but wonder."
But fear didn't stand in the principal's way. He regularly came out of the school to tell the dealers to leave his students alone.
Even though he wasn't the authorities, Mr. Roussenq found it unacceptable that drug dealing was going on in plain sight. So he put a stop to it in a very physical way. Several times he faced up to these young people and said, "Listen, kids, no. There will be no dealing outside my school. It isn't happening. It's over."
One day, he saw a deal with a student who was paying someone inside a car. And Clément, politely, with a smile, said, "Gentlemen, please leave the parking lot." And the driver told him, "The parking lot is for everyone. It's not the school's parking lot." So he said, "Okay, I'm calling the police." 2 seconds later, they left.
Did Clément Roussenq put himself in danger while trying to protect his students?
You can easily imagine that someone who suddenly comes and mixes things up and kicks a hornet's nest, to use a common expression, is a nuisance. He could cause trouble for the low-level drug dealers, because the major dealers don't go there. It's a chain, as we know, so he could get in the way of operations running smoothly.
I'm convinced there's a connection with drugs. Clément's arrival disturbed an established system.
The Phare de Loup projects are now at the center of the investigations. The police are particularly interested in 4 members of a rap group whose name, HLM36, regularly tagged on the walls of the school, was also written on the vandalized car.
The investigators inquire about the people behind these tags. They soon launch a wave of interrogations of several young people from the Phare de Loup projects.
On September 29, 2003, at 6:30 a.m., the homicide detectives cordon off the Phare de Loup projects. The rap group members are questioned. 3 of them are taken into custody.
To make the most of the lead, they use handwriting analysis. Who could have written it? No one among the people being questioned is able to reproduce the tag that was found on Clément Roussenq's car.
The rappers deny any involvement in the murder. They also deny being the authors of the tags on Clément Roussenq's car.
By the end of the custody, the police haven't managed to make a direct connection between Clément Roussenq's murder and the Phare de Loup projects. His car was tagged, so there's a tenuous link between the tagging and the projects. The police can't find any significant link between the murder and the projects.
All the members of the HLM36 group have a solid alibi for the night of the murder. They're all in the clear. A month before the murder, Clément Roussenq's car was seriously vandalized. According to the principal's loved ones, there was no doubt that this vandalism is connected to the murder. Do you share their opinion?
No, on the face of it. I don't think there's a connection. Unfortunately, cars are commonly defaced. As for the principal's car, it could be the work of petty thugs from the projects or bored students. Vandals and killers are not in the same category. In principle, they don't have the same profile. But what strikes me about this vandalized car incident is that Clément Roussenq interpreted it as a threat. The principal was a man with authority and strength of character who wasn't easily intimidated.
It's a shame that Clément Roussenq didn't give the police the marker and the knife that were used to damage his car. Can you explain why he didn't hand in these two objects that might have led to identifying the vandals?
It's baffling, and it's even more surprising that he kept both items to himself in the office. Why? What did he intend to do with them? It's a mystery. It suggests that the principal didn't want anyone to know who had damaged his car.
While investigating the Phare de Loup project's lead, the police discovered that since his arrival at Virebelle Middle School, Clément Roussenq had been disrupting the hashish trade that was rife around his school. Do you think his intervention could have led to his murder?
No, I don't believe that was the motive for the murder. We're talking about a few ounces of cannabis sold near the school. When small-time hash dealers are chased from one area, they sell 200 yards away, and that's all. When scores are settled in the drug trade, it's between dealers and for much larger quantities of drugs.
The local project's lead was still explored, but there was no material evidence to connect the different suspects to the murder. Their fingerprints and DNA were compared with those found at the crime scene and in the phone booth where the call was made, but it came to nothing.
That isn't surprising, because honestly, I can't imagine one of those individuals phoning Clément Roussenq and having a long conversation with him without arousing his suspicions. To convince the principal to leave home in the middle of the night, they had to be very persuasive. No offense to these individuals, but with their way of speaking and their inner-city young people's vocabulary, they would have had a hard time convincing the principal to leave home.
To better understand the events on the night of the murder, the police go to La Ciotat marina. Clément Roussenq told his wife that he had reattached the boat's mooring lines. Did he really do it? Was he seen on the dock by witnesses? The investigators will try to answer these questions. Clément Roussenq's boat is a beautiful 32-foot sailboat. It's docked at Slip 24 on the south embankment. The anchorage is open to the public and can be accessed on foot from the parking lot. The police note that the mooring lines of the victim's boat are correctly attached. Were they really detached on the night of the murder? Did Clément Roussenq really check the lines? To answer these questions, the investigators view the security camera footage at La Ciotat harbor. To their surprise, Clément Roussenq doesn't appear in the footage.
There are 3 cameras at the harbor. None of them had seen him. To be precise, 2 of them saw neither him nor his car, and one was a little blurry.
A white car filmed at 11:18 p.m. in the public parking lot could possibly be the victim's vehicle, but nothing is certain. The police officers then question the security guard who monitors the harbor. The individual works shifts between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m.
The harbor puts it bluntly. There's 1 security guard, not 40. This security guard didn't see anything. There was no one else at the harbor. No one saw him. There are no witness statements reporting that he was seen either at the harbor or on the way to the harbor.
The investigators then interviewed the owner of the sailboat docked near Clément Roussenq's. His testimony turns out to be highly interesting. According to Maurice Mattioni, no boat owner would have fallen for a call purported to be from the harbor master's office.
I've been at the harbor since it was built. I've never been called to the harbor at night. I find it hard to believe that the harbor's master's office called Clément that night.
It's not usual practice to call someone at 11 p.m. on a windless night, a peaceful night with a full moon, to tell them, "Come here immediately to moor your boat."
If I received a phone call at 11 p.m., 1, I would ask for the caller's name, and 2, I would call back, because knowing the customs, I would never have answered a call under those circumstances.
Clément Roussenq was a serious and cautious man. Did his love of his sailboat cloud his judgment?
You have to wonder what was going through his head for him to jump in his car. It wasn't the kind of weather where you'd need to call someone out. I talked it over I don't know how many times with Helen, his wife, and we never came up with an answer.
But then why did Clément Roussenq leave his apartment?
It makes you wonder all the more since he wasn't totally at ease. The situation at school, the vandalism of his car, had made him worried. It's strange and suspicious.
The police start to consider that Clément Roussenq didn't tell his wife the truth.
Mrs. Roussenq was the one who told us that her husband had told her he'd just gotten a call that there was a problem with his boat at the harbor. He said what he wanted to say, so naturally, we don't know the content of this phone call.
I asked Hélène, Mrs. Roussenq, is it possible that Clément could have lied to you? She told me, the only reason I would have let him go out was if there was a problem with his boat. So he could have lied to me, because if he told me something else, I wouldn't have let him go out.
Did Clément Roussenq have something to hide? Was he keeping secrets from his wife?
My dad was a mysterious person. Sometimes we thought, today Dad looks like something's up, but we didn't know, and then it went away.
The investigators still don't know where Clément Roussenq went on the night of the murder after receiving the phone call at 11:02. They search for answers in his private life.
They try to find out if he was having an affair.
We've heard everything Mrs. Roussenq said at the start, right? There was no hint, neither big nor small, of any kind of marital problem or affair going on. Why not? No.
He loved Helen. He loved his wife. He was a good husband and father. He just lived his life. Clément wasn't interested in any of that. He cared about his job and his family.
A new piece of evidence then revives the investigation. On one of the walls of the school, the police find graffiti threatening a certain White Grandpa. And White Grandpa was Clément Roussenq's nickname in Africa. From this point, the investigators focus on the principal's past.
When it came to his different posts before Virebelle, in Africa and America, he didn't go much into detail. He very rarely talked to us about that.
Why is Clément Roussenq's African nickname resurfacing? Is the murder connected to his overseas assignments?
Couldn't this international career perhaps have attracted the interest of the Secret Service? He went to high places, embassies, whether in Washington, Cairo, Africa. He met people in charge of these governments. So a man like him could be of interest.
Sylvain Fournier reported on the case for La Marseillaise.
The complexity of how the murder took place makes it necessary to think outside the box. So you wonder if it's something that followed him back from overseas.
What had he done? Did he have other troubles, other problems in a hidden and mysterious second life? No one knows.
According to Clément Roussenq's loved ones, this lead is completely unthinkable.
I know they looked into Dad's past, all his assignments as a Frenchman abroad, and this double life as a special agent, huge things. But no, one thing that did stand out was Dad was as white as snow.
I don't think Dad was a secret agent or worked for the intelligence service. No way.
Today, no one can say for sure if Clément Roussenq really went to the harbor to check his moorings. In the absence of witnesses, no theory can be ruled out.
I sometimes had the impression that Clément Roussenq wanted to protect his family. Maybe he was in trouble or at odds with some people without telling anyone. He might have taken the motive with him.
Clément Roussenq doesn't appear on the security camera footage, and no witnesses can attest to his presence at the harbor on the night of the murder. Do you think he never actually went to check his sailboat's moorings?
In my opinion, Clément Roussenq did not visit the harbor that evening. I'm not saying that because he's not on the security camera footage. I'm saying it because the security guard didn't see him. I'm convinced this conscientious man would have announced his presence to the security guard when he got to the harbor.
So you think Clément Roussenq lied to his wife?
Yes, it was a pretext so he could leave home without her asking any questions. Since the start, I haven't believed this story about a phone call from the harbor master's office. It's a tall tale. It doesn't hold water. Clément Roussenq couldn't have fallen into such a clumsy trap. He knew, like all the marina users, that the harbor master's office was closed at the time of the call. So the caller must have come up with another pretext to make him leave home. And he couldn't, or didn't want to, reveal this pretext to his wife.
That would explain the length of the call.
Yes, it took the caller 1 minute and 56 seconds to explain to him the reasons for the call, the reasons why he had to leave his home, where he had to go, and maybe who he had to meet. Clément Roussenq may have been the victim of blackmail. We can reasonably wonder about that. I believe that the solution to this case lies in the reason that made the principal leave his home that night.
At that time, investigations were carried out into Clément Roussenq's past. He held prestigious positions, notably in Cairo and Washington. Do you think that during these assignments he could have been approached by the Secret Service?
Yes, of course. It's something we could consider. But whatever the case, I don't think the investigation should go down that path for one simple reason. The modus operandi doesn't fit with that theory. However, we can't rule out that digging into his past will produce a solution. The reappearance of his nickname, White Grandpa, graffitied on the walls of the school, might not be as harmless as it seems.
The investigators then get hold of the first solid evidence in the case. The forensic laboratory technicians send them their test results. Fingerprints have been revealed on the pack of beer found outside the school. Comparisons against the police fingerprint database lead to the identification of an individual we'll call Farid. This 25-year-old man, who is single and unemployed, lives in La Ciotat. He's known to the police for violent robberies.
He could be a witness of the crime scene. The homicide detectives need to and must question this person.
The police wiretap Farid's phone, but the recorded conversations don't provide the investigation with any valuable evidence. In November 2003, the young man is taken in for questioning. At 7 a.m., he's informed that he's being placed in custody. After his studio apartment is searched, his interrogation begins at the Marseille police station.
He says, I never go to Virebelle Middle School to drink beer. I have nothing to do with this murder. All right, the cops listen to him.
Farid firmly denies being in front of the school on the night of the murder. He adds that he doesn't understand how his fingerprints ended up on the pack of beer found outside the school.
It's such a serious case. Who would admit to being at the scene on the day it happened? Especially if you have a criminal record.
While his interrogation continues, the police decide to question his friends and family.
He has a small problem here. One of his friends, just after Clément Roussenq's murder, boasted that he knew the perpetrators.
Other people were also questioned. One friend even said he was scared, because the day after the murder, he basically made it clear to me that he was there, that he had used a knife. With the way he looked at me, It was disturbing.
But Farid defends himself and claims that he was just making a bad joke inspired by the movie Scarface, which he had watched a few days after the murder with his friends. A few hours into his police custody, the young man accounts for his whereabouts on the night of the murder. He explains that he spent the evening with a friend.
This friend admitted that they drank the beers at the supermarket next to Virebelle Middle School. They went to the school to dump the trash and the empty cans. And then they headed downtown. This is another lead that comes to a dead end.
Due to a lack of concrete evidence, the police bring the interrogations to an end, and Farid, still protesting his innocence, is released from the Marseille police station.
The individual was released from custody because the police were unable to get any proof that he was involved in any way in Mr. Roussenk's murder.
Drinking a few beers while smoking some joints doesn't make you a murderer.
But almost a year later, this lead is resurrected when a spontaneous testimony incriminates Farid's nephew. The police consider the possibility of collusion between the two men. In May 2004, a man shows up at the police station in Ciotat. He reports seeing an individual running from the crime scene on the night of the murder, and he identifies Farid's nephew in photos. But the police officers soon discover that this eyewitness is being treated in a psychiatric ward, so they can't take his statement as gospel, and the interrogations of Farid and his nephew lead nowhere. In search of a new lead, the detectives decide to refocus their investigations on the victim's professional life. The police go through the content of Clément Roussenq's computers. They also read all his personal notebooks. They come across several documents that prove the principal was at odds with several members of the teaching staff.
It doesn't take long to find out that the atmosphere inside the school wasn't all sunshine and roses. It seems that Clément Roussenq disrupted an existing order or disorder. Or simply because in professional relationships, new management can create tensions.
After his appointment in September 2000 as Virebelle Middle School's principal, Clément Roussenq quickly clashed with his main associate.
There were problems with his direct associate. They didn't have a good relationship. It's possible that at the beginning there was a little jealousy that was aroused by the fact that Clément came in as the principal. And it was a position that his colleague may have been after.
This colleague also lives with her family at the official accommodation on the school's premises.
If there's tension, obviously, it can be exacerbated when you're forced to cross paths or be near each other all the time. In general, it's often recommended that people don't live in the same place where they work.
This associate regularly questions Clément Roussenq's decisions and undermines his authority.
He told me about her in a meeting once when we were together. He told me she wasn't hardworking, and it was causing problems by putting him in an awkward situation.
The investigators also learned that Clément Roussenq had a very bad relationship with one of the gym teachers.
Clément told me that when he arrived, sports took up a lot of the time for extracurriculars. Clément wanted to use that time to put on math or reading workshops for the classes that needed them, instead of rock climbing. So he did that because he was the boss. But that created a lot of problems and friction between them.
In his journal, the principal criticizes the associate and the gym teacher for their insolence and lack of professionalism. He also reveals that these two individuals are having an extramarital affair.
Everyone knew about this affair, from the administration office to the teacher's room, even the students.
Once, I caught them in her office when I entered without knocking. They were together, and I could tell I was disturbing them. It was all very weird.
Clément Roussenq opposed this relationship.
In my opinion, Clément Roussenq was a prude who didn't like public displays of affection.
The principal became obsessed with the adulterous couple. He recorded their comings and goings and the absences his associate took to be with her lover.
Clément was direct, but he came across some dishonest people. Clément told them that he didn't like it and that they had to stop.
After several warnings that made no difference, Clément Roussenq eventually decided to inform his superiors.
Not only did Clément Roussenq reprimand them in front of everyone, but he also told the school inspectorate.
The police think they have a new lead. They wiretap the couple's phones.
It's clear that for the investigators, suddenly, this seems more believable than some kids smoking joints and wanting revenge because he stopped them from dealing. And for the investigators, there's a motive that's strong and twofold, with professional rivalry. There you have it. At that moment, the police are saying, there's something serious going on here.
The associate and the teacher are questioned several times, but no evidence against them is found. In November 2003, the teacher receives a threatening letter accusing him of being the murderer. He decides to show the letter to the police. He repeats that he has nothing to do with the crime. However, the investigators don't abandon this lead, and they continue to wiretap the two suspects. On May 26, 2004, 8 months after the principal was murdered, there's a dramatic turn of events in the investigation. The associate and the teacher are taken into custody.
I hear that 2 of Dad's colleagues are in custody. I'm waiting to find out why. I don't know any more details. I can't imagine they got on so badly that they killed him.
It surprised me because even if there aren't disagreements in a management team, surely there are always disagreements at schools. If principals were killed for that, there would be no principals left.
The police learned that the 2 lovers were in regular contact with the student's father, who had a very strained relationship with the victim.
Clément Roussenq's relationship with this person was sometimes troubled. Insults were flying back and forth.
What if this trader who worked at the Ciotat harbor was connected to the murder?
This was a pretty violent person. One evening after a meeting, Clément told his wife, "That person scares me." And Clément could tell if someone was pretending to be a bad guy or if they were the real deal. For him to say, "That person scares me," it must have been serious.
The 2 lovers remain in custody. In a neighboring room, the student's father is also being interviewed.
In police custody, people's schedules are checked. Naturally, the schedules, meals, and communications a few hours or a few days before the incident are checked. And nothing directly incriminated the people who were in custody.
The traitor has a cast iron alibi.
He was driving. There's absolute and conclusive proof that he was not at the scene of the crime. He was caught on a speed camera on a highway dozens of miles from Ciotat at the time of the murder.
Both Clément Roussenq's associate and the gym teacher were with their families on the night of the murder to celebrate their birthdays. Their relatives confirm they were there.
Everyone who was suspected or in the hot seat had a birthday that night. It's astonishing. They were all born on September 24th or 25th. There were birthday parties everywhere. In Ciotat, it was the week of birthdays.
The police released them from custody. The suspects couldn't physically have committed the murder. But could the murder have been ordered?
Can we consider the possibility of a contract on Mr. Roussenq's life? The simple answer is yes. From whom? By whom? I know absolutely nothing. What I do know is there could be a contract from any of the leads that we've just mentioned.
After exploring the most likely leads of the students and the small-time thugs from the local projects, the investigators focused on Virebelle Middle School's teaching staff. They found out that Clément Roussenq had clashed openly with his direct associate and the gym teacher. Do you think these two individuals could have had something to do with the murder?
As in all spheres, tensions can arise between certain people. And here, the tensions were exacerbated by the fact that the principal informed the inspectorate, which isn't done. It's not part of the culture. Generally, these kinds of problems are solved internally. So, of course, this could have given rise to ideas of retaliation, resentment, ideas of revenge. But that's a whole world away from committing murder. I wouldn't go that far. And then we always come up against the same obstacle, the modus operandi. It doesn't match the profile of the two suspects.
With every lead the investigators followed, each suspect had an alibi. That's why the plaintiffs have put forward the theory of a contract killing. Do you think it's possible?
The contract killing keeps rearing its ugly head. Until a case is solved, we can imagine anything. But in this case, nothing supports the idea of a contract. I can't imagine a hitman using a knife. In general, this kind of person uses a gun instead. The only conceivable possibility is that petty criminals were hired to simply scare Clément Roussenq, and the situation went downhill.
The investigation has shown that Clément Roussenq, who was authoritarian, uncompromising, and extremely strict as a principal, came into conflict with students, young dealers, and even co-workers.
He made so many enemies that this case has many suspects with credible motives. This also explains the significant quantity of police custodies and wiretapping in this investigation. It's clear that the Marseille police are fumbling their way along. They still don't know which leads to focus on.
We need to understand what happened. Today, I can't answer the question of why my father died. And that's rough. I have daughters, and I can't tell them why they don't have a grandfather.
We've made sure to keep going and live with Dad's absence, but without knowing why or how. We live with it every day.
Today, Clément Roussenq's loved ones fear that the case will be dismissed, ending the investigation and destroying their hopes of finding out the killer's name.
For us, a dismissal means, go on, move along, there's nothing to see. And then there will be someone rubbing their hands together in La Ciotat or elsewhere and going, that's it, it's fine, I'm off the hook. And that's unacceptable. It's unacceptable.
I would like this program to help move things forward. For people to think, I remember seeing something. I know that memory is complicated, but I hope it loosens some tongues and brings forward testimonies or just one detail that could help us move forward.
In December 2007, there was a final twist in the investigation into the murder of Clément Roussenq. After a family argument, a young man with a criminal record was reported to the police by his father, who accused him of taking part in the murder. Once again, Clément Roussenq's family had hope. Once again, they were disappointed because no proof of the individual's guilt could be produced. Today, while waiting for the case to be solved, the victim's loved ones are calling for Virebelle Middle School to be renamed after Clément Roussenq. They would see it as recognition for his exemplary professional career. Good night.